G'day ladies and gents, Cubic Meter here. In my previous video, I introduced this absolute behemoth of a copper oxidization factory. But less than a day after that video went live, and this design has already become extremely obsolete. A user by the name of Worst Pacifist contacted me via Discord and shared with me some cutting edge research about copper oxidization. And naturally, as a scientific mind myself, I immediately refuted his claim and forced him to prove it. And so he then followed it up with simulation results from a program that he coded himself using Python, and then he found the absolute optimal layout of copper blocks for maximum oxidization per unit volume, and then proceeded to simulate the copper variations that we obtain over time for this layout. First impressions of this graph raises some serious red flags, as you might notice that each of our copper oxidation states occurs around 2 hours for just the exposed copper, 4 hours for weathered copper, and up to 6 hours to obtain the fully oxidized copper. However, the important detail here is the volume density. Our previous design has only one copper block for every 125 cubic meters. However, this new layout by Worst Pacifist is 75 times the density at about 1.7 cubic meters per copper block. But here's the money question. Is spreading out the copper blocks 75 times faster than this new layout by Worst Pacifist? Looking at my spread out arrangement, and we obtain peak harvest times of oxidized copper of 72 minutes for the final stage and 22 minutes for the weathered stage. For Worst Pacifist, our harvest times are much longer, at about 5 hours for oxidized copper, 3 hours for weathered copper, and about 1 hour for exposed copper. So if we use the layout by Worst Pacifist, for each individual copper block which enters the system, it will take 4.3 times longer to oxidize. However, when we factor in the 75 times increase in volumetric density of copper blocks, we go from a copper factory looking like this to a copper factory which looks like this. I kid you not, this tiny factory down there has the exact same rates as this entire copper factory. And this one in the middle is capable of producing oxidized copper at the maximum speed of 18,000 blocks per hour. So how exactly does this new layout work? You might actually notice that we have already oxidized copper present in the factory. And this is meant to counteract at least one of the ways in which copper oxidation slows down. You see, when a copper block is random ticked, it will count all other copper blocks within this diamond shape around it. And the game will assign two coefficients. First, we have A equals to 6, which is the total number of unwaxed copper blocks around our particular copper block that was random ticked. We'll also assign a value called B, which is the total number of copper blocks with a higher oxidization state than the block that was ticked. We also have a coefficient called M, which is equal to 1 only if our copper block is a pure copper block. It will be 0.75 if there's any other copper block variant. We start by calculating the coefficient C, which is given by B plus 1 divided by A plus 1. C will then be used to calculate the probability that our copper will oxidize, which goes as M multiplied by C squared. No, I'm afraid not that MC squared. We go ahead and substitute our coefficients, so B equals to 3, A equals to 6. Our result is that we get a value of C equal to 4 divided by 7. And then substitute this into C down below, and our M is equal to 1. This gives us a result of about 33%. So this is the probability of this particular copper block oxidizing if it were random ticked. If instead our copper block is on its own such that it's at least 4 blocks away from another copper block, we end up with A equals 0, B equals 0, and M equal to 1. And going back to our original formula, it's pretty clear that this layout gives a 100% chance for our copper to oxidize from the first state. And if instead, this copper block is either of our two other oxidized states, we end up with m equals 0.75, which reduces our probability to 75%. But what is critical here is to keep in mind that the addition of any higher oxidized state of copper will increase both our A value and our B value, and thus adding oxidized copper around a particular copper block will vastly increase the probability of it oxidizing. So that's pretty cool. We can speed up our copper production just by adding oxidized copper around it. However, I did mention that there are two ways in which copper production can slow down, and this one is a massive bottleneck. If this exposed copper counts any lesser oxidized copper in the vicinity around it, its chance of oxidizing to the next stage is 0. What this basically means is that this exposed copper will not advance to the next stage of being weathered copper unless this block is ticked and oxidizes to exposed copper. Only then will either of these blocks then be able to advance to the next stage, and once this happens, this block will not be able to advance any further until this block has also weathered. The result of this is that if you have a lot of copper blocks very close together, they will all want to oxidize uniformly over time. As you can see, they all turn to exposed copper at roughly the same time, and now they'll all revert to weathered copper at the same time, and now they'll all convert to oxidized copper at roughly the same time. In fact, this is why in the model produced by Worst Pacifist, we see these very distinctive peaks of each of the copper block variants over time. So first we get a massive wave of exposed copper, then we get a massive wave of weathered copper, then finally we get our oxidized state. And funnily enough, Worst Pacifist also produced this graph of his same layout, but without any oxidized copper to catalyze the reaction. And you can clearly see that all of a sudden, our layout is actually worse than our original arrangement, as it takes up to 120 hours to obtain our final oxidized state. So if we did not have all of this oxidized copper catalyzing the reaction, even this massive farm would only be half the speed of the original. But simply with the addition of this oxidized copper to catalyze the reaction, this farm increases the rates by 10 times over the old one. So yeah, the old design is hilariously obsolete at this point. However, I'm not even disappointed, because working with this farm, working with the challenges of powdered snow, and making all these crazy block conveyance techniques, honestly, all of this was worth it. Alright, that was a lot of scientific theory, but still very interesting and exciting to learn about. Now, what I want to do is get mechanical, because while the theory of why this farm works is quite interesting, we need to put that theory into practice and make something practical for survival Minecraft. This is where I can hopefully make up for something that I missed in the previous video. I really just completely glossed over the way in which I designed all of these block conveyors in order to move blocks from a centralized point all the way through the silos to be oxidized, and finally being recombined into a central blast chamber. The place where I started is with this highly TNT efficient blast chamber. I didn't actually physically paste it into the world when I started. Instead, I simply kept the idea of this blast chamber clear in my head while I was designing all of the other systems for the factory. What I needed to consider is that this blast chamber has 1, 2, 3 and 4 separate input block streams, which can handle a maximum speed of 16 game tick interval. Now, when I talk about the speed of a block conveyor, I generally like to think of it in terms of the interval between blocks being moved. So this of course means that a faster block stream has a smaller interval, and the fastest interval that any block stream can handle is 3 game tick. However, these block streams are very impractical and unrealistic, because by default In vanilla, the player can only place down a block every 4 game ticks by holding down the right mouse button. And it turns out that this speed is exactly equal to the speed in which 2 hoppers can transfer items. And this is important to think about, because if you want copper blocks to go in every 4 game ticks, those blocks will also eventually come out of the blast chamber every 4 game ticks as well. And so you'll need exactly 2 times hopper speed to handle all of those items. So now that we're measuring the speed of our block streams as the interval between blocks, we know that we have 1, 2, 3, 4 block streams entering our blast chamber, and each of these block streams can handle a speed of up to 16 game ticks between each block. So combined, all 4 of these separate block streams can handle one single 4 game tick block stream split between them. So now we have a good idea of what our block streams need to look like going into this blast chamber. We can then head to the very start of our machine and figure out how we distribute blocks. The basic concept is that we have a player placing down a block every 4 game ticks. This feeds into a 4-way splitter, which separates our 4 game tick block stream into 4 separate 16 game tick block streams. By increasing the amount of time that blocks move, we simply give ourselves more time to actually do stuff with those blocks. In fact, each one of these 16 game tick block streams is divided even further into 2 separate 32 game tick block streams, which are then split between our oxidization silos. We can now go ahead and start up the factory, and you can see our 16 game tick block stream gets slowed down even further into these 32 game tick block streams. Now, when we're distributing blocks to the silos, we run into another problem. Pistons have a limit of 12 blocks, which is the maximum amount of blocks they can push. So once our block streams start to get too long, the block stream will seize and start causing problems. You might notice with this block stream disabled, the other 3 have increased their speed to 12 game tick to compensate. Amazingly, you can extend a block stream like this without even having to redirect it. All you need is one of these specialized sticky piston block stream extenders. So I have 2 observers like that. I'll use a wall, because one important detail is that we do not want to power anything with observers looking into these copper blocks, because they can oxidize at any moment and cause this observer to trigger. So by indirectly observing the movement of the block streams, we can avoid this issue. In order to complete this circuit, all I need is some more observers and some rails. And now, if I go ahead and remove this block, we are now capable of extending the push limit of this block stream. And these extenders can handle a minimal interval of 8 game ticks. So in the copper factory, by using these extenders, we're capable of distributing the 32 game tick block streams between 12 pistons, multiplying our 32 game tick interval by the 12 pistons it gets distributed between, and we get this system being activated every 384 game ticks. Our block distribution will then propagate even further between 11 blocks to fill an entire plane of the copper silos. What this means is that each layer in our copper silos will move every 4,224 game ticks, which is about 3.5 minutes per layer. What we then have inside the silos are all of these sticky block extenders, which actually move the layers from bottom to top, allowing us to get maximum volume density of our blocks throughout the column. So now that we have our blocks all distributed throughout the silos, here comes the really tricky part of merging everything back together and sending it all to our centralized blast chamber. It all begins when we detect that the layers are moving. When this occurs, all that we do is simply flip this switch, as will happen in a moment. There we go, a layer just moved. This switch has flipped off and started up this 384 game tick clock. And what this will do, this will increment this 11 block counter. We count 11 blocks because we have 11 blocks to move out of each layer. With each increment of this counter, it will extend a set of sticky pistons and push another set of blocks in towards the center. Every time that we increment one of these blocks, we will also begin this 12 block counter, which is clocked at 32 game ticks. This will trigger the piston feed tape that will eventually feed blocks all the way into our central blast chamber. And once again, a shout out to West Pacifist, who gave a lot of input on how to arrange these piston feed tapes. Let's just go over again how we're distributing blocks around the factory. We start with the player placing down a block every 4 game ticks. This is multiplied by 4 separate block streams to give us an interval of 16 game ticks per block stream, which is then split again into 2 separate 32 block streams. Each 32 game tick block stream then fills up 12 spaces, making 384 game ticks. Then finally, we have every layer of the silo being filled up every 4,224 game ticks. At the bottom, we then receive a layer every 4,224 game ticks. We push in a set of 12 blocks into these mergers every 384 game ticks. Blocks then come out of the mergers every 32 game ticks. The outputs from 2 silos are then merged together into a 16 game tick block stream. And finally, we have our 1, 2, 3, 4 16 game tick block streams entering our blast chamber, producing 18,000 copper blocks per hour. And of course, this is my special smart blast chamber, which has its own inbuilt fault detection. Check out the video about this blast chamber for an explanation of how the fault detection works. In this particular case, if we detect a fault anywhere in any of these block streams, the blast chamber should shut off immediately, like so, send a warning, and furthermore, it will completely shut down all the systems of the copper factory. And man, that fault detection is really fast. I can just go in and inspect all of the sides of the blast chamber. So here we have 5 blocks. 5. Here we only have 4. So if I just add a block here, reset the alarm, and the blast chamber will start up perfectly fine. Another detail you might notice is that this copper is not actually fully oxidized yet. This is because this factory can't actually handle placing down the blocks at full speed. And that's simply because this particular design is not big enough. If you wanted to ensure that you can oxidize copper at the maximum speed possible, you would need to build this behemoth. But I highly doubt that anybody would need 18,000 oxidized copper per hour. Instead, all you really need to do with the smaller layout is run it intermittently. So if you just switch it off, then we can let all the copper oxidize. And once all the silos are filled with oxidized copper, I can just throw in some new batch of copper. Grab some to put in my hand, start the farm, and then run the farm for about 5 minutes. Alright, I just finished running the farm for about 5 minutes. And we already have a full shulker box of oxidized copper. And as you can see, just that shulker box of oxidized copper barely made a dent in the capacity of these silos. That is the volume density working for us. With the capacity of this particular layout, you should be able to harvest 1 shulker box of oxidized copper per hour. So effectively what you can do is run this farm at full speed for 5 minutes every hour or so in order to get a shulker box per hour. The other copper block variants, however, are a bit trickier to obtain this time, because you need to actually run the factory at the highest speed for much longer time periods in order to obtain them. But here's something that I didn't quite know when I made the previous video. I was aware that using an axe on oxidized copper would revert the state of it. However, I assumed that this would reset it all the way back to pure copper. I wasn't actually aware that it goes to the previous state. So you could just obtain oxidized copper, use an axe on it whenever you want to obtain the other variants. At least that's how I'm assuming you would use the oxidized copper if you were building with it. So there we have it. We finally have a fully autonomous oxidized copper factory, which is also extremely practical to use in survival. Be sure to grab a schematic of the design, or the world download down in the description if you want to try it out yourself. Goodbye for now, and I will see you next time.